Welcome back. This is another Swordmaster Publications presentation. I'm Ernie Lawrence, and tonight we're going to be studying the book of Deuteronomy in chapter 11. Moses is continuing to speak to the kind of the second generation that came out of Egypt. These are the people who were children when the events that were recorded in the book of Exodus happened. They were the ones that were 20 and under when the curse was given after the spies came back, and that was in Numbers 14. They came back and gave a good report of the land, but a fearful report as well. And God told them that for every day that they were in the land spying it out, which was 40, that they would be cursed to wander in the wilderness until all of that generation had perished except for Joshua and Caleb. And so now we're talking to the second generation. Moses has been giving them a reminder of the power of God to instill in them some awe, to remind them that God is able to deliver on his promises. He's even ended the last chapter with a reminder of a promise fulfilled, that Abraham was promised that they would number as the stars, and they now do number as the stars, and then some. In fact, if you look at the number of stars that can be seen with the naked eye, they're well past that number. And so now he's going to come at them with more of a blessing and a reminder of what they're supposed to do going forward, and talking about the days moving forward until the fulfillment of their purpose. So let's begin Deuteronomy chapter 11 and verse 1. Therefore thou shalt love Jehovah your God, and keep his charge and his statutes and his judgments and his commandments always. And know you this day, for I speak not with your children, which have not known and which have not seen the chastisement of Jehovah your God, his greatness, his mighty hand, and his stretched out arm, and his miracles and his acts, which he did in the midst of Egypt, unto Pharaoh the king of Egypt, and unto all his land. And what he did unto the army of Egypt, unto their horses and their chariots, how he made the water of the Red Sea to overflow them as they pursued after you, and how Jehovah has destroyed them unto this day, and what he did to you in the wilderness until you came into this place, what he did to Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, the son of Reuben, how the earth opened her mouth and swallowed them up, and their households and their tents, and all the substance that was in their possession, in the midst of all Israel. Okay, so all of these things that Moses is reminding them of, he's again reminding them of all the mighty things that God had seen. And these people, the adults that he's speaking to, were children when a lot of this took place, growing up into adulthood as these things took place. But their children were not witness, certainly to the things of Egypt, because remember, all of the people coming out of Egypt that were 20 and younger probably didn't have children. And if they did, they would have been infants. A pair of 20-year-olds may have had infants or something like that. But, their children were not witness to the things that God did, bringing them up out of Egypt. Almost all of their children would have been born during this wandering in the wilderness. And so he's like, your children did not see all of these things, but you did. That's what verse 7 says. But your eyes have seen all the great acts that Jehovah which he did. And so he's reminding them, and he's saying, you need to remember these things, and you need to pass these things on to your children, because they weren't witnesses. And so we'll talk about that, and then I'm going to apply it to us here in just a minute. It says, therefore you shall keep all the commandments which I command you this day. So again, we're talking about more than just 10 commandments here. He says, you'll keep all the commandments that I command you, that you may be strong and go in and possess the land wherever you go to possess it, and that you may prolong your days in the land. That comes up over and over and over again, the prolonging of their days, staying there for a long period of time, which Jehovah sware unto your fathers to give unto them and to their seed, a land that flows with milk and honey. So the Jews, had they obeyed God, had they been faithful to God, they would have prolonged their days. I see here, because Moses in Deuteronomy multiple times gives them this condition, this blessing and a curse we're going to see here in just a minute. The idea of, if you remain faithful to God, if you remember the things that he did, if you obey him, then he'll prolong your days. And if you don't, then he'll ultimately destroy you. We know that Israel wasn't faithful, that they only remained until the coming of Messiah by God's will, but almost immediately after that, in the grand scheme of things, for all of their disobedience, read Matthew chapter 23 again, that they were guilty of all the sins leading up to that point. They murdered the Son of God, and they were persecuting the Lamb's bride, and they were removed out of the way for it. The curse comes true, and I can only imagine that if Israel had remained faithful from this point, just imagine a kind of a what if. What would Israel be like today? What would the nation be like today? Would they still be blessed? Would they have been blessed with independence, with strength, with all of these things that God is giving them today? If for whatever reason God's plan had been carried out by whatever means were available, but that Israel had remained faithful, what would that look like? Well, God is giving us that picture. He says, keep all that I've commanded you, prolong your days, and I will provide for you and protect you. And I think Israel threw that away. I think they didn't fully grasp it in their I guess laziness or forgetfulness, or their fleshly desire, the desire for physical things. They set aside God. God wasn't doing anything grandiose. He wasn't doing anything super powerful. Once they came into the land and they possessed the land and they were at peace, it really brings to mind this idea that Israel seeks after a sign, that they need something to be a constant reminder of God's almighty power. And in times of peace, when everything is going their way and God's almighty power is just blessing them in the day-to-day things, like providing food and wellness and protection and peace, instead of thanking God for that kind of blessing and power from him, they forget about him and they turn to other gods. And then that's when they begin to lose the blessings that God gives to them. And in that they need that constant, like children, literally like children, they need that constant sense of wonder. So that's just what I get out of this, is that they needed to see that. And Moses is saying, don't be that way. Remember these things, pass them on to your kids so that they know of God's power. Okay, so verse 10, verse 9 again, and that you may prolong your days in the land which Jehovah sware unto your fathers to give to them and to their seed, a land that flows with milk and honey. For the land whither you go in to possess it is not the land of Egypt, from where you came out of, where you sowed seed and watered it with your foot as a garden of herbs. But the land where you go to possess it is a land of hills and valleys, and drinks water of the rain of heaven. So in other words, Egypt was kind of a barren land. It was difficult to maintain, and they didn't get to keep anything that they did, just enough to stay alive as the servants of Egypt, as the slaves of Egypt. And Moses is saying, the land where you're going, it drinks the water of the rain from the sky. It is fertile. It is lush. It is a beautiful land. And it says in verse 12, a land which Jehovah your God cares for. The eyes of Jehovah your God are always upon it, from the beginning of the year even unto the end. So even with the wicked nations there, in fact, probably in spite of the wicked nations being there, God is taking care of this land. This is the land that Abraham and Lot came into and found so lush and wonderful, and were growing so rapidly that they had to split up. God sees this land as an amazing land, and a place where he wants his children or the children of Israel, the children of Abraham, to grow and be cared for and nurtured to bring Messiah into the world. And so even when the wicked nations are there, God is blessing that land, and the wicked are just living off of it. It comes to the idea in terms of the physical universe. God causes it to rain on the just and the unjust. God gives the physical blessings to all mankind, whether they're good or evil. And hopefully those blessings will turn the evil into good, and so they will recognize God's bounty and his blessing and his creation. But even if they don't, God is still taking care of this land in preparation for the coming of the Israelites. And so his eyes are always upon it. And it says, "And it shall come to pass, if you shall hearken diligently unto my commandments, which I command you this day, to love Jehovah your God, and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul." There's that greatest command. It keeps getting repeated. "That I will give you the rain of your land in due season, the first rain and the latter rain, that you may gather in your corn, your wine, and your oil. And I will send grass in your fields for your cattle, that you may eat and be full." So God's going to provide all these peacetime blessings. And Moses says that during this time, when God is blessing you with all of this, remember the mighty things that he did to bring you out of wicked Egypt. Remember the mighty things that he's going to do to conquer these wicked nations before you and remove them from the land. Because in the peace times, when God's bounty and blessing is not these grandiose gestures, but just the day-to-day blessings, you're going to forget. And you can't do that, or your days in the land will be shortened. "Take heed to yourselves, that your heart be not deceived, and you turn aside and serve other gods and worship them. And then Jehovah's wrath be kindled against you, and he shut up the heaven, that there be no rain, and that the land yield not her fruit, lest you perish quickly from off the good land which Jehovah giveth you." Now, did this ever happen? Sure. Look in the book of 2 Kings. Remember the rain was shut up and there was drought, and Elijah was called on, and Elijah, he wasn't have anything to do with it. He it's your wickedness, is what he says. Were the days shortened? Did God cause them to be perished off the land before time? Yeah. The northern kingdom, when they separated out, they went straight into wickedness, and they never came out of it. Wicked king after wicked king after wicked king. Assyria comes, conquers them, and disperses them well before Messiah ever comes on the scene. They don't exist. The northern kingdom doesn't exist in the time of Christ. Those bloodlines, gone by the time of Christ. They are impure, muddled, mixed in with the Gentiles. You have the Samaritans, and then you have others that are so diluted as by the law of Moses. It talks about the 10th generation coming into the temple. They never can, because their bloodline is so diluted. There's no getting back to the purity anymore at that time. And so this is totally brought to pass to the northern tribes, and then again to the southern tribes eventually after they murder Jesus. They're wiped clean off the face of the earth. Jerusalem is destroyed. The temple is completely wiped out. No stone left one on top of the other. Judaism is ended for all intents and purposes. So, let's see. Verse 18, "Therefore shall you lay up these my words in your heart and in your soul, and bind them for a sign upon your hand, that they may be as frontlets between your eyes." So, we see this idea of the hand and the eyes, putting it here and then putting it here. And we read about this in other places as well. The Israelites took this literally. In the rabbinical tradition, what they would have is these little boxes called phylacteries, and they would tie them to their wrists, and they would tie them as these little boxes on their foreheads. And what they would do is they would write a scripture on a little piece of paper, and they would put it in the little box, and then they could take it out and read it as a reminder to themselves. And I'm not saying that's bad, wasn't required, that's not what the law meant here, but that's the idea here is for them to put the scriptures into their actions. In everything that they did, they were to remember God, that every thought that they had, they were to remember God. The idea of praying without ceasing, keeping God in the forefront of everything that you think and do is the idea here. And in Revelation 13, when we read about the mark of the beast, everybody today there's a whole bunch of craziness. America's probably in its waning years now with all of the things going on with our own government and the unrighteousness that pervades our culture and whatever. And there's a lot of the millennialists right now saying we're about to reach the so-called 7 years of tribulation, and Revelation is upon us, the apocalypse is upon us. Of course, that has nothing to do with Revelation. Has nothing to do with what's going on right now. Revelation was about things that happened in the first century, but they really talk a lot about the mark of the beast, and they think it's going to be like some kind of computer chip embedded in our wrists or in our foreheads or something along those lines. They take it very, very hyper literally. But when you read that, it says that people were not allowed to buy and sell if they didn't have the mark. And the idea of the mark of the beast is the things that you did and the things that you thought or said, because speaking language is conveyance of thought, is if you were to go into the marketplace and you didn't say, all hail Caesar, or Caesar is God, or something along those lines. If you didn't give active obeisance to Caesar, who was lifted up as a god. Nero was the first Caesar to proclaim himself a deity while he was still alive. All the way back to Augustus, they proclaimed them deities after they died. But Nero claimed it while he was alive. If you didn't give Caesar that obeisance with your actions and with your lips, with your thoughts, then you weren't allowed to buy or sell in the marketplace. And so the idea here is that you were to bind them for a sign upon your hand, that they may be as frontlets between your eyes. Think about that. Those two things are not independent. It isn't bind them on your hands and bind them between your eyes. It says bind them for a sign upon your hand, that they may be frontlets between your eyes. So binding them on your hand is what causes them to be in front of your eyes. If your actions are with the will of God always in your mind, if you're doing what God commands you to do, and you understand that when you do the actions of God, then it will be your actions will be a constant reminder of the things that God wants you to do. In other words, live your life according to the will of God, and you won't ever forget or be complacent in times of peace. That's what this is pointing to, is this idea of constant action according to God's commandments. Just do it God's way every time and daily, minute by minute, from sun up to sundown. If your actions are always the commandments of God, then you can't forget. And your every thought and intent of your heart will be towards God. And that's what Moses is telling them to do. And you shall teach them to your children, speaking of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. Think about that. If you're teaching your children, we sometimes get into this, and I don't know if everybody's like this, but I've heard it said enough that I believe that some people do this, or some people act this way. But I know my parents were very good about not just teaching or allowing the Sunday Bible class teacher to teach. I know that it wasn't just Sunday morning and Wednesday evening when we had Bible class or when we were in worship. My parents were every day, all the time, constant lessons of living life, and then how do we see God in what we do? How do we remember God in our actions and our thoughts? And very grateful for parents who raised me that way, and I'm trying to do the same thing with my own children. But if you're teaching your children every day from sunup to sundown, and everything that they do, reminding them of who God is and what he has done for us, then not only does that strengthen you and help remind you so that you don't become neglectful and go off to worship these other things, but you also teach the next generation to do exactly the same thing, so that their actions and their thoughts become constant reminders to themselves about God, and then teach them to teach their children to do the same thing, and it just passes on. The good can be passed on. We talk a lot about how the horrible things that maybe our parents did or our grandparents did, or if we had a grandfather who was a drunk, maybe then that made our dad or our mom become a drunk. Not talking about my parents certainly, but then that makes it harder for me to escape the cycle of alcoholism. We always talk about how the bad things get passed on from generation to generation. It's very hard to break the cycle. But what about the good things? What about when we do the things that God has told us to do, and we pass those on to our children, and we have a good cycle that we don't want to break? In fact, we reinforce that. My parents taught me well about how to follow after God, and to study the Bible, and to live the way that God wants us to live. And I'm not saying I'm perfect at all in that. That's not my intent here. But my parents have taught me that that's what they intended me to do, was to live a godly life. And now I teach that to my children. They teach that to my children whenever they have opportunity, and it gets reinforced, and it's a great cycle. It's a positive cycle that we don't want to break. And if we continue that, to reinforce that, and we live that way, and our kids are going to learn more from what they see us do than what we say to do. If we are treating others with kindness, and we use certain speech, and we act towards them a certain way, or we act towards others a certain way, the kids pick that up super fast. And then we can talk at them all we want, and they might absorb that, but they absorb way more if we live, if we do with our hands. And that's a cycle that we don't want broken. And so that's what Moses is trying to get across here to these people, is live for God and teach your children, and that will get passed off, and it will prolong your days. And then he says, you shall write them upon the doorpost of your house and upon your gates. I've seen in a lot of houses people with all over their walls, they've got scriptures written up. My parents, when I got married, gave me a little placard from Joshua 24 that says, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. You put those type of things up where you see them as daily reminders, your children see them as daily reminders, and it helps you focus. Those are good things. Some people kind of look at those and they think it's kind of cheesy, or maybe it's virtue signaling, or something along those lines. Well, don't let those naysayers get in the way of what God has obviously written as a way to remind yourself to live godly life. Write them on the doorpost of your house and upon your gates. Put those scriptures up all over your house. My parents have them all up all over their house. It's great. That's an awesome reminder. I even see them up on the walls of people who aren't necessarily Christians, but a lot of that maybe they have parents that are, or maybe they have friends that are, and they give them those, and they're good sayings. And you'll see the scripture quote, and then you'll see the little reference down below that, and they'll have them up in their houses. May not be something that convinces them, but it could also be something that does eventually, they see that day in and day out, and they see where it comes from. And then that gift might be the thing that have them ask more questions, especially when things are getting down. All of the things that they serve, all of the so-called false gods that they worship, don't ever provide any real power, money, other supernatural powers. I got a student of mine who's a full-on pagan. She calls herself a witch. It's completely shutting down in terms of school. Doesn't want to do anything because a high school diploma doesn't matter with regard to her witchy stuff. And she's going to find out that there's just not anything in that. There's no real power there. And if they see these things up on the walls of a friend's house or somewhere, maybe that's the thing that gets through to them. But it's certainly a great reminder to us to have those constant daily reminders of who Jehovah God is, and that our faith should be put into him and him alone. And then verse 21, that your days be multiplied, and the days of your children in the land which Jehovah sware unto your fathers to give them, as the days of heaven upon the earth. That's an interesting phrase. That your days may be multiplied, the days of your children, that Jehovah sware to your fathers to give them as the days of heaven upon the earth. And I looked up this phrase. What does the days of heaven mean? What could we, because if we think about heaven, the ultimate heaven, the highest heaven, God's presence, God's throne room, whatever you want to call it, the place we want to go to when time ends, it's eternal. It doesn't have days. There's no time. It's superior to time. It exists outside and above it. So the days of heaven has to do something with authority, and it has to do with something related to the days, I guess, allotted by heaven. And so as I was trying to think through that, I was like, okay, I have an idea, I have a hypothesis, but I can't say for sure, and I really want to know for sure. So I did a word search or a phrase search on days of heaven, and I only found one other place, and it was Psalm 89. And it fits perfectly in with the hypothesis that I had, because if you look at Psalm 89, we're talking about a psalm here that is pointing directly to Jesus. For Jehovah is our defense, and the Holy One of Israel is our King. Then you spake in a vision to the Holy One, and said, I have laid held upon one that is mighty, I have exalted one chosen out of the people. I have found David my servant, with my holy oil I have anointed him. So David, King David, was a boy that God wanted to be king. He was a man after God's own heart. But most importantly, David was a type pointing to Christ. Okay, the throne of David, we see all that in Acts chapter 2. So listen, with whom my hand shall be established, my arm shall also strengthen him. The enemy shall not exact upon him, nor the son of wickedness afflict him. And I will beat down his foes before his face, and plague them that hate him. But my faithfulness and my mercy shall be with him, and in my name shall his horn be exalted. I will set his hand also in the sea, his right hand in the rivers. He shall cry unto me, Thou art my Father, my God, and the rock of my salvation. Also I will make him my firstborn, higher than the kings of the earth. My mercy will keep for him forevermore. My covenant shall stand fast with him. His seed also will I make to endure forever, and his throne as the days of heaven. So there's that phrase, days of heaven. In that David is the type pointing to Jesus Christ, this idea of days of heaven, talking about the covenant shall stand fast with him, his seed will endure as the days of heaven. I will make him my firstborn, higher than the kings of the earth. That's David pointing to Christ. Jesus sits as the kind of the firstborn from the dead. He was the firstborn of the resurrection of the dead, higher than the kings of earth. He's the King of Kings. All of this is wrapped up in this days of heaven. That is the days appointed by God to bring Messiah into the world. That's what the days of heaven references. So here in Deuteronomy 11, your days be multiplied, the days of your children, in the land which Jehovah sware unto your fathers to give them, upon the earth as the days of heaven, until the Messiah comes. That's what he's talking about here. He's referring to the coming of the Messiah, the time when Jesus would come into the world as a human. And Israel was to be preserved. Remember, Moses has just been telling them, you're not the point. Israel, you're not the point. You're just the vehicle. You're just the means that God is going to use to fulfill his promise to Abraham. Because remember, Abraham was promised that his seed, not seeds as many, but seed, would bless all nations. And that seed was Christ. Paul talks about that. And so all of this is wrapped up in Jesus Christ. He is the point. He is the entirety of the Bible. The Old Testament looks forward to him. The New Testament talks about him and explains him, gives us the image of him so that we who live beyond the biblical times can look back and see that is the Son of God, and we should obey him. And so Jesus is the point, not Israel. For if you should diligently keep all these commandments which I command you, to do them, to love Jehovah your God, to walk in all his ways, and to cleave or to cling unto him, then will Jehovah drive out all these nations from before you, and you shall possess greater nations and mightier than yourselves. So Israel would conquer all of their enemies, no matter how powerful they were. If they're staying faithful to God, all of their enemies would fall before them, because God is mightier than all creation. Every place whereon the soles of your feet shall tread shall be yours. From the wilderness and Lebanon, from the river Euphrates, even unto the uttermost sea shall your coast be. In other words, he calls out the same promised land marked off before. There shall no man be able to stand before you, for Jehovah your God shall lay the fear of you and the dread of you upon all the land that you shall tread upon, as he has said unto you. All of their enemies are going to be afraid of them. It doesn't matter how mighty, physically strong they were. It doesn't matter that they had giants or whatever. They were all going to be afraid of Israel, because Israel was going to just march through and wail on everybody, conquer. And the more they conquered, the more afraid the other remaining nations would be, because Israel wasn't ever losing, and they weren't losing people in these battles. And so Moses says, behold, I set before you this day a blessing and a curse. God's promises are always conditional. There's an if. If you do this, then I will do this. A blessing if you obey the commandments of Jehovah your God, which I command you this day, and a curse if you will not obey the commandments of Jehovah your God, but turn aside out of the way which I command you this day, to go after other gods which you have not known. And it shall come to pass, when Jehovah your God has brought you into this land, whether you go to possess it, that you shall put the blessing upon Mount Gerizim, and the curse upon Mount Ebal. Okay, so this idea is that they're going to write these things on these two mountains to remind them of what God said. If you keep my commandments, you will be blessed and prolong your days. The curse on Mount Ebal, they go up to that mountain and they read the curse there. If you fail to obey me and you go after false gods, then the curse will follow you. And it says, are they not on the other side of Jordan, by the way where the sun goes down, in the land of the Canaanites, which dwell in the Champaign, over against Gilgal, beside the plains of Moreh? So that's up over against the Mediterranean Sea, all the way across the other side of the Promised Land from Jordan. So they're on the farthest east of the Promised Land, being on that side of Jordan, and these two mountains are on the farthest west. So they would have to cross the entire Promised Land to get to them. And so when they finished conquering, essentially, they were to write on these two mountains the blessing and the curse, to remind Israel all of their days these two things. For you shall pass over Jordan to go in to possess the land which Jehovah your God gives you, and you shall possess it and dwell therein. And you shall observe to do all the statutes and judgments which I set before you this day. So Moses is kind of wrapping up his his precursor of I'm going to give you these commandments. That's what Deuteronomy is about, all of these commands. Moses is saying, this is why you should do them. What I'm about to give you, what I'm about to tell you in terms of commands, this is why you need to keep them and why you should pass them on to your children. So, an interesting chapter. Some things that I think are maybe new for people. The days of heaven thing was new for me. That's one of the great things about doing this study is I get down into the detail and try to understand these things. I'm gaining new information as well. I'm growing and learning, and I love doing this because of that. And so hopefully it's something that you're able to do as well. But anyway, let me know what you think. Let me know what you think about the days of heaven. Did I get that right? Was that an accurate hypothesis and analysis? Give me some feedback. Tell me what you think about this chapter. You can do that in the comments or any of the other means you have for contacting me. I know I post this up in several places, so you can comment on those threads and on social media or whatever. But anyway, appreciate you joining me tonight. My name is Ernie Lawrence, and this has been another Swordmaster Publications presentation. Y'all have a wonderful evening.